Evening, friends. The fire's burning low tonight. There's just enough of a glow left in these coals to keep the dark at a polite distance, and I'm grateful for that. The kind of night where you don't need much warmth from the flame itself. It's more the company of it. The way the last few orange threads of heat curl up between the stones and vanish somewhere above us into that wide, wide sky. I can hear the creek from here, just barely. Cottonwood Creek, running slow the way it does this time of year, when the snow melts come and gone, and the water's settled into something patient, almost like it's resting too. I had my chair pulled close a while ago, but I've eased it back some. There's a comfort in sitting just far enough from a fire that you can feel the coolness of the air on the back of your neck while the front of your hands still catch that fading heat. Somewhere out past the fence line, I can hear one of the horses shifting in the corral, just a quiet hoof against packed earth. Nothing restless, just letting me know he's there. The stars are out full tonight. Not the kind of sky where they seem far away either. Tonight they feel low, like they've settled closer to the ground than usual, as though the whole vault of heaven has taken a deep breath and leaned in. I don't study the constellations the way some men do. I just let them be where they are and trust they know their own business. Now, I was sitting here a while before you came along, just turning something over in my mind. Not a worry, nothing like that. More of a memory, the kind that comes without you calling for it, the way a barn cat appears at the door when the evening cools. You don't summon it, it just arrives, sits down, and waits for you to notice. This one's from a good while back, spring of '88, if I'm placing it right. Early spring, when the days were finally stretching themselves out past supper time, and the air had lost that last bitter edge of winter, but hadn't yet turned warm. There was a softness to the light in those weeks. The sun still hung low even at midday, casting everything in a kind of golden sidelight that made even the plainest stretch of ground look painted. I was still deputy then, younger by a great many years than I am now, though I didn't feel young at the time. You never do, I suppose. I had a full day's work behind me, the kind that's made up of small duties rather than any single important one. I'd walked Main Street that morning, checked the latch on the feed store after old Harlem Gaines mentioned it had been sticking, and I'd spent the better part of an hour helping Mrs. Calloway move a writing desk from one side of her parlor to the other. She changed her mind twice, and I carried that desk back and forth without complaint, because that's what you do in a town like Cottonwood Creek. The work of a deputy wasn't always what you'd read about in the papers back east. Most days, it was just being present, being steady, being the man folks saw walking past their window at the same hour each morning, and that was enough. But that particular evening, Sheriff Pardee had handed me a folded paper, a warrant, technically, though it wasn't the kind that carried any weight of danger behind it. A man named Crawe, who lived out past the Western Ridge, had failed to appear for a property matter at the county seat. Nothing criminal, nothing heated, just a piece of legal business that had gone unanswered long enough that someone in town had finally written it down and asked that it be delivered. Pardee could have sent it by post, and it would have gotten there eventually, but he preferred that certain things be handled in person, and I never argued with that preference. There's something to be said for looking a man in the eye when you hand him a piece of paper with his name on it. It says the law still remembers you exist, and it says so gently. So, I saddled up. My horse at the time was a sorrel gelding named Copper, not for any clever reason, just because of the color. He was a calm animal, the kind that didn't need much persuading. You'd lay the saddle blanket across his back and he'd stand there like he'd been expecting it, maybe shift his weight once from one hind leg to the other, and then he was ready. I liked that about him. Some horses want to negotiate every step. Copper just went where you pointed him. I remember tightening the cinch and running my hand along the leather of the strap where it had started to show wear. The saddle was older than the horse. I'd bought it secondhand from a freighter who'd passed through Cottonwood Creek 2 summers before, and it had already been well used by then. But it fit well enough, and I'd rubbed neat's foot oil into the seat and fenders until the leather turned supple again. There's a particular feeling to a saddle that's been cared for over time. It gives just slightly under your weight, like it already knows the shape of you. I led Copper out through the back gate and mounted up near the water trough. The sun was still above the ridge to the west, but just barely, and the shadows were long. Everything in town had that stretched out quality. The shadow of the livery stable reached clear across the alley and touched the base of the general store. The shadow of the church steeple lay thin and sharp across the dirt of 2nd Street, like a line drawn with a pencil. I rode out slow. There was no hurry. The road west out of Cottonwood Creek wasn't much of a road, if I'm honest. It had been a proper trail once, a freight route connecting the valley to a now abandoned mining camp higher in the hills, but by '88, the traffic had thinned to almost nothing, and the desert had begun reclaiming it. The ruts were still visible in the harder packed sections, and here and there you could see where a wagon wheel had cut deep enough into the clay that even seasons of wind hadn't smoothed it over. But between those marks, the sage and dry grass had crept in, narrowing the path to something more suited to a single rider than a team and wagon. Copper's hooves made a steady, unhurried sound against the ground. That's one of the things I've always found most settling about riding. The rhythm of it. Not the speed, not the direction, but the simple repetition. Step after step after step. And each one sounds almost the same as the one before it, with just enough variation to keep it from being mechanical. A little softer here, where the ground is sandier. A little sharper there, where a flat stone sits just beneath the surface. You start to hear music in it if you ride long enough. Not a melody exactly, but a cadence. Something your body falls into without thinking. The land opened up quickly once I passed the last fence post at the edge of town. Cottonwood Creek sits in a gentle depression between 2 low ridges, and the town itself is sheltered on 3 sides by hills that aren't high enough to call mountains, but are tall enough to hold the morning shade. Riding west, you climb out of that depression gradually, and the view unfolds like someone pulling a curtain aside. To my left, the ground sloped down toward a dry wash that only carried water after a hard rain. I could see the smooth stones lining its bed, pale gray and white, catching the last of the sunlight. They looked almost like a path themselves, as though someone had laid them there deliberately, one beside the next, leading somewhere I couldn't see. To my right, the land rose gently toward the ridge, covered in low brush, sagebrush mostly, with a few clumps of rabbit brush still holding the dried-out seed heads from last autumn. They had turned a dull silver brown, and the breeze moved through them with a sound that was almost like whispering. though of course it was just air passing through dried stems. I kept Copper at a walk. There was no cause to go faster, and the evening was too fine to rush through. The air had that particular quality you get in the desert in early spring. Dry enough that you feel it in your nose and at the back of your throat, but not harsh. Cool enough to be pleasant without needing a heavier coat. I had my jacket on, the canvas one, with the wool lining that I wore for most of 3 seasons. And it was just right. Not too warm, not too thin. There's a satisfaction in being dressed exactly for the weather you're in. It's a small thing, but small things make up most of a life. The sun touched the ridge. I watched it happen the way you'd watch a candle being lowered into a jar. First, the full disk, burning gold against the sky, then the slow compression as the ridgeline began to cut across its lower edge. The light changed. It went from that open, honest gold to something deeper, amber, then a kind of reddish bronze that colored everything it touched. My hands on the reins looked darker. Copper's mane caught the light and turned from sorrel to something close to the color of dried clay. Even the dust that had settled on my trousers seemed to glow for a moment, as though it had been ordinary all day, and now, in the last light, had remembered it was once part of something grander. I've watched a lot of sunsets in my years, thousands probably, and I won't pretend that every one of them moved me. Some evenings you're too tired, or too occupied, or too much inside your own head to notice what the sky is doing. But that evening, riding west into the fading day, I was paying attention, not because I decided to, but because there was nothing else asking for my attention. No task pressing, no voice calling, just the horse beneath me, the ground ahead, and the sun going down like it had done every evening since before anyone was here to watch it. The Warrant sat in my breast pocket. I could feel the edge of the folded paper against my chest when I breathed in, just a faint pressure, like a reminder. I'd looked at it before I left. Read it through once in the sheriff's office while Pardee leaned against the doorframe and rolled a cigarette he never lit. The language was formal, the kind of writing that uses 10 words where 2 would do, but the substance of it was simple enough. Eldon Crawe owed a response to the county regarding a parcel of land whose boundary had been disputed by a neighbor. Not a feud, not even an argument really, just one of those quiet disagreements that arise when 2 men look at the same piece of ground and each sees the edge in a slightly different place. I'd met Crawe once before, maybe twice. He was a lean man, older than me by a decade or more, who kept to himself out on a small homestead west of the ridge. He raised a handful of cattle and grew what he could in a kitchen garden that probably didn't yield much in the dry years. I had no reason to think he'd be anything but civil when I arrived. Most men are, when you come to them calmly and treat them with respect. It's the ones who feel cornered that give you trouble, and Crawe wasn't cornered. He was just forgetful or indifferent, or maybe a little of both. The road curved gently northward as I crested the first rise, and from there I could see a good distance ahead. The land spread out before me in long, easy rolls. Not flat, but not rugged either. It was the kind of terrain that tricks you into thinking you can see everything because there are no trees or buildings to block your view. But the gentle undulations hide more than you'd expect. A man could be riding in a shallow draw just a quarter-mile away, and you'd never see him unless he topped the rise. But there was no one, just me and Copper and the open land and the sky doing its slow work overhead. The color was changing again. The bronze had cooled to something softer, a dusky pink along the western horizon, shading up through lavender into a deep, quiet blue that was almost purple. I've never been much for naming colors. I know the names people give them, but they never quite match what I see. The sky that evening wasn't any single color. It was a conversation between several, and they were all speaking at once, and somehow it wasn't noisy. It was harmonious, the way a chord is when the notes are right. I let my weight settle deeper into the saddle. Copper's stride was even, and I found myself breathing in time with his steps. 2 steps in, 2 steps out. I didn't plan that. The body just does it. After enough hours on horseback, you become part of the animal's rhythm, or he becomes part of yours, and after a while, it doesn't matter which. You're just moving together across the ground, and the ground is patient beneath you, and the sky is wide above you, and the whole arrangement feels like something that was always supposed to be exactly this way. There was a smell in the air that I've never been able to name properly. It wasn't the sage, though sage was part of it. It wasn't the dust, though dust was there too. It was something underneath those, something mineral and faintly sweet, like the ground itself releasing the heat it had stored during the day. You smell it most clearly just after sunset, in that narrow window when the air cools faster than the earth, and the warmth rises up and carries with it whatever the soil has been holding. I've smelled it 1,000 times since, walking the edges of Cottonwood Creek on summer evenings, but that night it seemed more distinct somehow. Maybe because I was paying attention. Maybe because the road was quiet enough to let me notice. About 2 miles out from town, I came to a place where the road crossed a shallow creek, not Cottonwood Creek, but a smaller tributary that didn't have a proper name as far as I knew. Some folks called it Willow Run, though I never saw a willow along its banks. It was more of a seep than a creek, really. A thin line of water moving slowly across a bed of fine gravel, no wider than a man could step across, no deeper than the sole of a boot. But it was water, and Copper's ears pricked forward when he smelled it. I pulled him up and let him have his fill. He dropped his head and drank in long, slow draughts, and I sat there in the saddle and listened. The sound of a horse drinking is a quiet, private thing. The soft pull of lips against water, the faint gurgle as the stream adjusts around the muzzle. I've always liked it. It's one of those sounds that belongs entirely to the moment. You can't recall it later with any accuracy. You have to be there, listening, while it happens. While Copper drank, I looked back toward Cottonwood Creek. From this slight elevation, I could just make out the edge of town, the roof of the livery stable, the top of the church steeple, and a thin line of smoke from someone's chimney, probably the boarding house where Mrs. Phelan kept a fire going well into the evening. The town looked small from here, which it was, but it also looked settled, like something that had decided where it belonged and wasn't going to be moved. I liked that about it. I still do. The wind picked up slightly, not gusting, just a steady breath from the northwest, that pressed the brim of my hat and moved the dry grass in long, slow waves. You could watch those waves travel across the hillside the way you'd watch a ripple cross a pond. Except there was no center point, no stone thrown. The wind just moved, and the grass moved with it, and the whole hillside seemed to be breathing. Copper raised his head, water dripping from his chin, and stood still for a moment with his ears turned toward something I couldn't hear. Horses do that. Listen to things that are below the range of a man's hearing, or maybe just pay attention to sounds a man has learned to ignore. I waited. He didn't spook, didn't tense. After a few seconds, his ears relaxed, and he shifted his way, which was his way of saying he was ready to go on. I gave him a light press with my heels, barely a touch really, more of a suggestion, and he stepped forward through the shallow water without hesitation. The sound of his hooves in the creek was different from the sound on dry ground. Softer, more layered. The water added a kind of thickness to each step, and tiny splashes caught the last glow of the sky and flashed briefly before falling back. It lasted only a few strides, and then we were across and back on the dry track, and the sound returned to its familiar, steady pattern. The road ahead was straighter here, following the contour of the land, between two low ridges that ran roughly parallel to each other. I could see perhaps a mile ahead before the road dipped into a shallow swale and disappeared from view. The light was nearly gone now, just a thin band of color along the western horizon, like a ribbon laid across the edge of the world. Everything else had turned to shades of blue and gray, and the first stars were beginning to appear, not dramatically, but one at a time, as though they were checking to see if it was safe to come out. I thought about Eldon Crawe, sitting out there on his homestead, probably finished with his evening chores by now. I imagined him in a chair on his porch, if he had a porch, or standing in the doorway of his cabin, watching the same sky I was watching. Men who live alone tend to watch the sky more than those who have company. When there's no one to talk to, the sky becomes something of a companion. It doesn't say much, but it's always there, and it changes just enough to keep you interested. I wondered what he'd think when I rode up. Probably nothing much. A rider approaching at dusk wasn't unusual out here, though it wasn't common either. He'd see me coming from a distance. The land was open enough for that, and he'd have time to form his own thoughts about it before I arrived. I preferred that to surprising a man. Let him see you coming. Let him decide for himself whether to be worried or at ease. Most men, given that choice and that time, choose ease. The saddle creaked beneath me as I adjusted my weight. That sound, the slow, low groan of leather under pressure, was as familiar to me as my own breathing. I'd heard it every day for years, and I never grew tired of it. It was the sound of purpose, in a way. Not urgent purpose, not grand purpose, but the simple purpose of going from one place to another with a reason for the trip, however small that reason might be. I reached into my jacket and touched the edge of the Warrant again. The paper was slightly warm from my body heat, and the fold had softened from being carried. I didn't take it out. There was no need to read it again. I knew what it said, and I knew what I'd say when I handed it over. Something plain and respectful. Something like, "Evening, Mr. Crawe. I've got a paper from the county seat that needs your attention when you're able." Nothing more than that. The paper would speak for itself. The ground beneath us changed slightly as we continued west. The hard-packed clay gave way to something sandier, and Copper's hooves sank a little deeper with each step, which slowed his pace just enough that I could feel the difference. The sound changed too, less percussive, more muffled, as though the earth were absorbing each footfall rather than reporting it. I didn't correct his speed. We were in no hurry, and the softer ground was easier on his legs. Off to my left, a jackrabbit broke from behind a clump of sage and bolted across the open ground in that strange, bounding gait they have, more like flying low than running. Copper's head turned to watch it, but he didn't break stride. The rabbit disappeared into the brush on the far side of the draw, and the hillside was still again, as though nothing had moved at all. I smiled at that. The desert has a way of erasing events almost as soon as they happen. A jackrabbit runs, the dust settles, and 5 minutes later there's no evidence it was ever there. The sky had deepened to full dark on the eastern side now, and the stars there were bright and steady, but to the west, a thin glow still clung to the horizon, pale green shading up into blue. I've heard some men call that the afterglow, which seems like a fine enough name. It's the light that remains after the source is gone, not the sunset itself, but the memory of it, held in the upper air for a while longer. It's a patient kind of light. It doesn't demand attention, it just stays until it's done, and then it fades without complaint. The road dipped into the swale I'd seen from higher ground, and for a short stretch I was enclosed on both sides by gently sloping banks covered in dry grass. It was like riding through a very shallow, very wide ditch, and the effect was a sudden quieting of the wind. The breeze that had been pressing against me from the northwest was blocked here, and the air went still. The temperature felt a degree or two warmer in the shelter of the swale, and the silence was deeper. I could hear Copper's breathing clearly now, the soft expansion and release of his lungs, the faint whistle of air through his nostrils. It was steady and calm, and I matched my own breathing to it again. Without thinking, we climbed out of the swale on the far side, and the wind returned. Gentle but persistent. Ahead of me, the land leveled out into a broad, flat expanse that stretched toward the western ridge. I could see the dark line of the ridge against the sky, and above it, a single bright star, low and steady, brighter than the others, probably a planet, though I couldn't say which one. It sat just above the ridgeline, like a lantern hung in a window, and it gave me a point to ride toward, which is a comfort when the road becomes harder to see in the fading light. The flat ground here was different from the land closer to town. Less sage, more open grass, or what had been grass anyway. By early spring, most of it was dried and pale, waiting for the rains that might or might not come. It made a soft, continuous rustling sound as the wind passed through it, like the turning of many pages at once, very far away. I let myself listen to that sound for a while, and it filled the space around me in a way that felt almost like company. I thought about the men I'd known who preferred to ride at night. There were a few, not outlaws, necessarily, just men who felt more themselves in the dark. The daytime, with its brightness and its demands and its visibility, could feel like an obligation to some. But the night was private. You could think your own thoughts without anyone reading your face. You could ride at whatever pace suited you without anyone judging whether you were going too fast or too slow. The night didn't ask anything of you except that you keep moving or sit still, and either one was fine. I wasn't one of those men. Not entirely. I liked the day well enough. I liked seeing the town going about its business, the sound of Harlan's hammer at the forge, the children crossing the street on their way to the schoolhouse, the way the light fell through the windows of the general store in the late afternoon and lit up the jars of preserves on the shelf like colored lanterns. Those things mattered to me. They still do. But I understood the appeal of the dark, especially on an evening like this. One, when the land was quiet and the sky was full and the road ahead asked for nothing more than my steady presence upon it. A coyote called from somewhere to the south, a single note, high and thin, that hung in the air for a moment and then trailed away. It wasn't answered. I've heard people describe coyote calls as lonesome, and I suppose they can be, but that night the sound didn't carry any sadness for me. It was just a creature doing what it does, announcing itself to the night, marking its place in the dark. Not so different from what any of us do. When you think about it, Copper's ears flickered at the sound, then settled. He was a horse who'd spent enough nights on the trail to know the difference between a sound that mattered and a sound that didn't. He kept his pace, and I kept mine, and the road carried us steadily westward. I could begin to make out something ahead now, a faint, irregular shape against the darkness that resolved as I drew closer into the outline of a fence line. Cedar posts, widely spaced, with a single strand of wire between them that caught just enough starlight to be visible. This was the eastern edge of Crawe's property, or what passed for it. Out here, fences were more suggestion than barrier. They told you where one man's notion of his land ended and another's began, but they didn't keep much in or out. A calf could step over that wire without effort. A man on foot could duck under it. The fence was a formality, and both the builder and anyone who encountered it understood that. I followed the fence line for a while, riding parallel to it rather than crossing it. There was no gate that I could see, and I didn't want to ride through a man's fence in the dark, even a fence as modest as this one. Eventually, the road curved toward a gap where the fence posts ended and a rough track branched off to the north. This was the approach to Crawe's homestead, and I turned Copper onto it. The track was narrower than the road, really just two ruts through the grass, barely visible in the darkness. But Copper followed them without guidance, his hooves finding the packed earth of the ruts by instinct or by feel. I let the reins hang loose and trusted him. A good horse will find a path in the dark better than a man with a lantern. The land rose slightly here, and after a few minutes, I could see a light ahead. Not bright, more of a warm, dull glow, the kind that comes from a single lamp behind a curtain. Crawe's cabin. It sat on a small rise, and the light from inside gave it the look of something cupped in a hand, protected and small and steady. There was no other structure visible, no barn, no outbuilding, just the cabin and the dark land around it and the sky above. I slowed Copper to an even gentler walk, not out of caution, but out of courtesy. When you approach a man's home in the dark, you do it slowly. You let the sound of your horse carry ahead of you. You give the man inside time to hear you coming, to set down whatever he's doing, to step to the window or the door and look out and see a single rider approaching at a pace that says nothing is wrong. I could smell wood smoke now, faint and dry, the kind that comes from a small fire in a stove rather than a fireplace, juniper, maybe, or piñon. It mixed with the cold air and the scent of the dry grass and created something that felt like arrival. Not home exactly. This wasn't my home, but arrival at a place where someone lived, where warmth existed, where a man had built 4 walls and a roof and chosen to stay. I stopped about 30 yards from the cabin and sat still in the saddle for a moment. The light inside didn't move. No shadow passed behind the curtain. I could hear, very faintly, the sound of the stovepipe ticking as it cooled or heated, that irregular metallic sound that thin iron makes when it's conducting warmth. I waited. There was no rush. Then the door opened, and a figure stood in the frame, backlit by the lamp inside. I couldn't make out his features, but his posture was relaxed, one hand on the door frame, the other at his side. He didn't call out. He just stood there, looking in my direction, giving himself a moment to see what he could see. I raised a hand slowly. Not a wave, just a gesture, palm open, to show I was friendly. "Evening," I said, and my voice sounded quiet and small against the open land around us. "Deputy from Cottonwood Creek, I've got a paper from the county that needs your attention." There was a pause. Then Crawe, for that's who it was, nodded once and stepped back from the door, leaving it open. It was an invitation, plain and simple, the kind that doesn't need words. "Come in, sit down. Let's see what this is about." I dismounted and led Copper to a post near the cabin wall. There was no hitching rail, but the post was sturdy enough, and I looped the reins around it loosely. Enough to hold, not enough to bind. Copper stood where I placed him and lowered his head, content to wait. The inside of Crawe's cabin was smaller than I'd expected, but neat. A single room with a cot against one wall, a table and 2 chairs in the center, and the stove in the far corner. The lamp sat on the table, a glass chimney kerosene lamp with the wick turned low, casting a warm but modest circle of light that reached the walls but didn't quite illuminate the corners. The floor was packed, earth swept clean, a few items hung from pegs on the wall, a coat, a coiled rope, a cloth sack that might have held grain or flour. It was the home of a man who didn't need much and didn't keep more than he needed. Crawe himself was about as I remembered. Lean, weathered, with deep lines in his face that could have been carved there by wind as much as by age. He had gray hair, thin and combed back from his forehead, and eyes that were calm but attentive. He gestured toward one of the chairs, and I sat. He didn't ask what the paper said. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove. It was thick and dark and had clearly been sitting for some time, and set one in front of me before sitting down across the table. Then he looked at me and waited. I took the warrant from my pocket and unfolded it on the table between us. I smoothed it flat with my palm and turned it so the writing faced him. "It's a property matter," I said. "County wants a response from you regarding the boundary of your parcel. Neighbor filed a question about it. Nothing urgent. They just need to hear from you." Crawe looked at the paper for a long moment. I don't know if he read it or just studied the shape of it. The official letterhead, the small print, the signature at the bottom. Then he nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when he's known something was coming and has already decided how he feels about it. "I'll ride in next week," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, like a man who saved his words for when they were needed. "That'll be fine," I said. And that was the whole of it. The entire business that had brought me out here, the warrant, the delivery, the response, was over in less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee. Which I did, by the way. I drank the whole cup, and it was terrible. And I was grateful for it. We sat there for a while afterward, not because we had anything more to discuss, but because it seemed right. Two men in a small cabin at the edge of the dark, with a lamp between them and the night outside. Crawe wasn't a talker, and I didn't press him. We sat in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. The kind of silence that exists between people who don't need words to justify their presence in the same room. I looked around the cabin while we sat. There was a shelf above the cot with a few books on it. I couldn't read the titles in the low light, but I could see the worn spines, the softened corners. A man who reads is a man who keeps his own company well. I noticed a small window on the north wall, uncurtained, through which I could see a rectangle of sky filled with stars. It struck me as a fine thing to lie in bed at night and look out at that. No glass in the window, just an opening, and the stars right there, close enough to seem like they were part of the room. Crawe didn't ask me about town. He didn't ask about the sheriff, or the weather, or the news from the county seat, and I didn't volunteer any. Some conversations are better for their absences, for the things neither person says, because both understand that saying them would only fill a space that's already full. After a time, I stood, and Crawe stood with me. I thanked him for the coffee, and he nodded. I folded the warrant, his copy of it, and left it on the table. Then I walked to the door and stepped outside, and the night was there waiting, exactly as I'd left it. Copper raised his head when he heard me. I put my hand on his neck and stood for a moment, just feeling the warmth of him, the solidity. A horse's body is a remarkable thing to touch in the dark. It's alive in a way that reminds you that you are, too. I mounted up and turned him back toward the track. Crawe stood in the doorway behind me, and the light from his lamp cast a long, thin rectangle of gold across the ground. I didn't look back, not because I didn't want to, but because the moment felt complete, and looking back would have added something it didn't need. The ride home was quieter than the ride out, if that's possible. The stars were fully out now, all of them, it seemed, and the sky was so deep and so clear that I felt, for a moment, as though I were riding along the bottom of a great dark lake, with the stars as lights on the surface far above. The wind had settled into something barely perceptible, just enough to carry the scent of sage and dry earth, and the land around me was still in a way that felt deliberate, as though everything had agreed to rest at the same time. Copper knew the way back. I'd barely had to guide him. He followed the track to the road, turned east without instruction, and settled into the same steady walk that had carried us out. His hooves on the hard-packed earth made that familiar rhythmic sound, and I let it fill my ears the way a lullaby fills a room. Not demanding attention, just present. Steady, constant. I thought about Crawe in his cabin. By now, he'd probably turned the wick down on his lamp, or maybe blown it out entirely. He'd be lying on his cot, looking at those stars through the window, thinking whatever a man thinks when the day is done and the night has settled in. Maybe he was thinking about the warrant, about the ride to the county seat. Maybe he was thinking about nothing at all. Some of the best moments in a life are the ones where you think about nothing at all, and the mind just rests, like a horse that's been unsaddled and turned loose in a meadow. The road back seemed shorter, the way return trips often do. Not because I was riding faster, I wasn't, but because the landscape was familiar now. I'd seen it once on the way out, and seeing it again, even in the dark, gave each rise and dip and curve a quality of recognition that compressed the distance, the swale where the wind had gone quiet, the stretch of flat grassland, the shallow creek where Copper had drunk. Each one arrived sooner than I expected, as though the land itself were gathering up behind me, folding the distance closed. I could smell Cottonwood Creek before I could see it. The faint scent of wood smoke and horse and damp earth that hangs over a small town in the evening. It's a lived-in smell, warm and complicated, made up of 100 small contributions. Someone's supper, someone's pipe, the hay in the livery stable, the water in the creek. I've smelled it so many times that I sometimes forget to notice it. But that night, coming back from the open desert, it was distinct and welcome. The first thing I saw was the light in the window of the boarding house. Mrs. Phelan's lamp, burning steady as it did every night until she retired, which was never before 10. Then the shape of the rooftops against the sky. Then the darker shadow of the livery stable and the pale line of Main Street stretching south. I rode in slow, the same way I'd ridden out. Copper's hooves on the packed dirt of the main road sounded louder here, between the buildings, where the sound could bounce off the walls. I passed the general store, its windows dark, the barber shop, the office of the land surveyor, which was really just a desk in a corner of the assayer's building. Everything was closed and still. I turned Copper into the alley beside the sheriff's office and dismounted in the small yard behind it, where we kept the horses. The other stalls were empty. Pardee's horse was at the livery for the night, and the third stall, which we rarely used, had been taken over by a collection of old saddle blankets and empty feed sacks that no one had gotten around to moving. I unsaddled Copper in the dark, working by feel. The buckles were familiar under my fingers, and I didn't need light to find them. I lifted the saddle off and set it over the rail of the stall, then pulled the blanket and folded it. Copper stood patiently through all of this, and when I was done, I led him into his stall and gave him a scoop of grain and a pat on the shoulder. He turned to the grain without ceremony, and I left him to it. I stood in the yard for a moment before going inside. The sky above the alley was a narrow strip of stars, framed on either side by the dark walls of the buildings. It was like looking up through a canyon, except the canyon was made of wood and plaster, and the roofline of the sheriff's office. I took a slow breath and let it out, and the air tasted clean and cold and vaguely of the sage I'd been riding through. Inside the office, everything was as I'd left it. The desk, the ledger, the cold stove. A single lamp burned low on the shelf near the door. I'd lit it before leaving, knowing I'd return after dark. I turned the wick up just enough to write by, opened the ledger, and noted the errand. Date, name, nature of the matter, delivered and acknowledged. Simple entries, plain language. The ledger didn't need poetry. It needed accuracy and brevity and a steady hand, and I gave it those things. I set the pen down and sat back in the chair. The office was quiet. The lamp hissed softly the way kerosene lamps do when the wick is slightly uneven, and the sound became the only thing in the room. I listened to it for a while, the way you might listen to a cricket or a distant train, not because the sound was interesting, but because it was there, and the act of listening to it kept the mind from wandering into places it didn't need to go. Through the window, I could see a section of Main Street, empty and pale in the starlight. The dirt looked almost white at night, and the boardwalk along the storefronts cast a thin shadow that was barely distinguishable from the street itself. Nothing moved. The whole town was settled in for the night, and the peace of it was as tangible as the lamplight on my desk. I thought about the ride, not the destination or the purpose, but the ride itself, the long, slow passage across the open land, the rhythm of the horse, the changing sky. It had been a simple thing, a delivery, a brief conversation, a cup of bad coffee, and a ride home under the stars. That was all. But sitting there in the quiet office, with the lamp hissing and the night outside, it felt like something worth holding on to. Not because it was remarkable, but precisely because it wasn't. It was an ordinary evening made up of ordinary moments, and each one of them had been enough. I closed the ledger and capped the ink. I turned the lamp down low, not out, just low, enough to let the room dim without going fully dark. Then I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, and the sounds of the night came in through the window like guests arriving one at a time. The faint hum of the wind, the distant murmur of the creek, the occasional creak of a building settling, each one familiar, each one welcome. After a while, I opened my eyes, stood, and turned the lamp out. The office went dark, except for the pale rectangle of the window and the stars beyond it. I put on my hat, stepped outside, and pulled the door closed behind me. Main Street was quiet. I walked it anyway, north to south, slow, the way I always did, checking the doors and the windows and the corners of things, not because I expected to find anything wrong, but because the routine of it was a kind of prayer, a daily affirmation that the town was whole, that the night was calm, that everything was where it was supposed to be. My boots on the boardwalk made a low, hollow sound, and the boards gave just slightly under each step, the way old wood does when it's been walked on 10,000 times. I checked the latch on the feed store. It held. I checked the door of the general store. Locked. I stood for a moment in front of the barber shop and looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. A dim shape, hat and coat, and the faint glint of the badge on my chest. I didn't look long, just long enough to know I was still there. The walk home was short. My room was at the back of the boarding house, up a narrow staircase that Mrs. Phelan kept swept and oiled. The house was quiet when I entered. She'd already retired, and the only light was the lamp she always left burning in the hallway, turned low. I climbed the stairs, feeling each one under my feet, and opened the door to my room, and the familiar smell of it, the wool blanket on the bed, the pine of the walls, the faint trace of the soap I used, wrapped around me like a hand placed gently on a shoulder. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled my boots off, one at a time, and set them by the door. I hung my jacket on the peg. I set my hat on the shelf. Each action was the same as it had been the night before and the night before that, and the comfort of that sameness was deeper than any novelty could have been. I lay down on the bed and looked at the ceiling, which was dark and featureless, and I thought about nothing for a long time. And then I thought about the sky as it had looked from the swale, that deep, unbroken blue shading down to green along the horizon, and the memory of it was so clear and so calm that it felt less like remembering and more like being there again, riding through the quiet with copper beneath me and the stars above and the whole great desert holding still around us like a held breath that never needed to be released. And that, friends, is the whole of it. That's the evening I rode beyond Cottonwood Creek. I'm back beside this fire now, and the coals have gone mostly gray, with just a few spots of orange buried deep where the heat's still holding on. The creek is still running out there in the dark. The stars are still up there, same as they were that night, same as they've always been. And I'm still here. In this town I've called home longer than I've called anywhere anything. And I don't mind telling you that it suits me fine. Thank you for sitting with me for a while. Night is a more peaceful place when there's someone to share it with. If you'd like to come again another evening, I'll be here. The same fire, the same chair, the same old stories that don't mean much but somehow help pass the time. Now relax. Let the night come. There's nothing in it that will harm you. If you enjoyed my stories, you can subscribe for our new stories. Please don't forget to comment and like. Good night, friends. Sleep well.